The ping on my phone was small and ordinary, an innocuous blue dot on a map that should have meant nothing more than coordinates. I watched the dot flicker, like a heartbeat, and my breath fell out of my chest in a way that felt like a tangible thing. It sat there over an address I knew too well, 21 Cortlandt Alley. For a New Yorker, 21 Cortlandt Alley said everything the skyline wouldn't. It was a back lane that soldiered behind the glimmer of glass towers and boutique storefronts, the alley of the city's backroom deals. There were cameras that caught your license plate, but the city often didn't know what happened to the things that lived in alleys: drugs, excuses, and sometimes people who were never meant to be found. I stared at the map until the icons blurred and my wife's last text replayed in my mind. "I'll be home soon. Don't wait up." She'd sent a kiss emoji, the kind that used to make me smile automatically. It didn't this time. "Maya," I said aloud, because saying her name felt like anchoring something that was slipping. I thumbed open our messages again. No reply since the blue ping 30 minutes ago. Her location. Sharing had been a casual thing, two dorky adults treating smartphones like talismans. She'd started it after we'd moved here, terrified of the late trains and the city's appetite for forgetting people. I'd had it because knowing she was safe made the commute tolerable. My hands were steady until they weren't. I booked a ride, and the city unrolled like a map of threats: honking, streetlights, the metallic rasp of subway tracks. The Uber driver asked me something. Did I want radio? And I said no, because words felt heavy and would only weigh me down. I told him to go to Cortlandt Alley, like I knew I wouldn't come back the same. When I arrived, the alley looked like it always did in the movies, a slice of shadow between the city's glitter and its concrete. Steam lifted from the drains like the city exhaling. Garbage bags sagged against metal bins. A group of pigeons hopped into the gloom and vanished. I groped for my phone, and the blue dot was not helpful anymore. My wife's last heartbeat was a place on a map and not a person. "Hey," I called, voice raw. The echo came back, small and unfamiliar. There were no sirens. There were no paramedics. Just a cigarette glowing in the dark where an ashtray had once been. And then a man's voice. "You lost, buddy." He came out of the shadow with the look of a man who'd spent too much time reading other people's faces thin. In a leather jacket. An age I couldn't peg. I wanted to punch him for existing. I wanted to ask every stranger whether they'd seen my wife. Instead, I asked the only question that mattered. "Does this place have a front door?" He snorted. "All places have doors. Some of them are only for certain people." His answer was a joke and the sort of thing that tightened my lungs. I pushed past him and found the courtyard, an anonymous enclave behind a restaurant. A van idled, its engine ticking. A figure leaned in through the van's open back, its silhouette unmistakable when my brain rewound. Short hair, the slope of her shoulders, the lavender scarf Meyer always tied crooked in the winter. "May," my voice broke. She turned slowly, the way someone turns who is learning their face in a mirror. For a second, I thought I had been wrong, that it was a woman who simply wore my wife's clothes. But then I saw her eyes, a hollow I had never seen before, like someone had excavated something soft and left the shell. "Aaron," she said, the name doing strange things to her mouth, "you shouldn't be here." Her voice was the same steady, warm thing that had once wrapped around my insomnia and made it go away. But there was something else layered under it: distance. She held the van's side, as if to brace herself, and there was a bruise on her wrist, like the impression of a tight hand. My stomach knotted. "Hey?" I stepped forward and she raised a hand. It was almost the same as always, and that made me clumsy with relief and fury. "Where have you been? You texted. Your location." She glanced at my phone as if reality had a way of rearranging itself to fit what I saw. Her lips twitched. I didn't know you were tracking me. My world narrowed. Maya, I love you. Tell me where you were. She took a breath long enough to buckle me. I can't tell you that, can't or won't, she swallowed. The bruise bloomed redder as she flexed her wrist. Both. A van door slammed. Someone in the courtyard laughed too loud, a humorless thing. A man stepped out from the van's shadow, big and square, jawed with a look that suggested he handled uglier things for a living. He moved like a predator to its mate, and underneath my collar, something unclipped with an icy sound. That same predatory look had been the one I'd seen on news anchors describing disasters in the Middle East, on men who shook hands with politicians and then stepped into back rooms. "What's this?" he barked. "You bringing visitors now, Maya?" She flinched, and for the first time my anger spooled into something sharp and purposeful. "Hey, you're not going to talk to her like that." "Or what?" the man said. His voice was loose on the air, dangerous and amused. I should have left then. I should have called the police, sat in a witness stand, and described what I had seen like some paler man in a court movie. Instead, my feet kept moving forward because there is a kind of gravity that only love invents toward the thing you think you can fix. "Her name is Maya," I said. "She's with me." The man laughed in the way bars of iron clang together. "You married a ghost, pal. She's on our payroll now." "You what?" I started, and the world narrowed until all I could hear was the blood in my ears and the click of my phone falling into a pocket. He reached out and shoved my shoulder. "Get lost." The shove pushed, but it didn't push me over. I planted myself, and something led by panic and failing courage unspooled itself. "You heard her," I said, stupid and small. "You're funny," he said. "Listen, kid, you wanna talk to your freelance girlfriend. Go buy her back. Buy her back." That phrase was a bell in my mind. Cheap dinners, a cheap joke. Then the world flipped, reality folding into a darker book I had not read. Maya, my Maya, had been missing for 3 days. Her phone toggled off one night after a text, "I'll be home soon." The blue dot had landed on here only now because someone had turned her phone on to send an update. The bruise on her wrist made sense in a twisted arithmetic. "Where is she?" I demanded, and the man smiled like a man who had never been asked that before. "She's where she belongs," he said. "You want her, we got terms." They told me to go away. When I didn't, the man reached for his phone and punched numbers. Somewhere in the van, a glove thumped and someone came forward with a paper. A cheap legal pad wrapped in cellophane. The man from the van handed it to me like he expected me to trade my wife's life like a business transaction. It was a receipt, $15,000, wire transfer instructions, a deadline. My jaw sank like a stone. The city's pulse, outside, kept moving. People streamed past the alley's mouth, none of them stopping because the city has rules about what it will notice. The man leaned close. "Wire us the cash," he said, "and she'll be on the 8 p.m. commuter home. Don't wire. Maybe you get a phone call. Maybe you don't." When the man's back turned, it felt like the air had been siphoned out of the alley. Maya's hand locked around mine, warm and shaking. She bit her lips so hard I thought she might draw blood. "Who are they?" I asked. She closed her eyes. "I didn't know. You didn't know." She opened her eyes, and there was a small, dangerous calm in them I had never seen. "Aaron," she said slowly, "you don't know a lot of things about me." That sentence should have been clarifying and unmasking. Instead, it was a detonator. My trust telescoped into a million shards and lodged under my skin. "You're kidding," I said. I'm not kidding." She moved her hand to my face like she would comfort a child. "I would have told you, but sometimes people are forced." Her words tasted like lies and longing at once. Forced by whom? She wouldn't or couldn't say. The papers in my hand felt like a physical accusation. I could see the dollar amounts print themselves into my vision. $15,000. 0. The man from the van came back, impatient. You got till noon. I left the alley trembling with adrenaline and defeat braided together. The Uber ride back was a blur. At the apartment, the walls were the same color they'd always been, and yet those walls had become pages in a book I hadn't meant to read. I dumped the legal pad on the kitchen counter and opened my laptop because the city that hides things often leaves their footprints in the things we track. Transactions, emails, people with long names and short morals. I called my sister. Lucy had been my rock before Maya. Heard from Maya, she asked, voice papery with worry. I told her the man's words. She told me to get the police. I told her the police would come if the money was transferred or when it was too late. She said what sisters always say, get help. Don't do anything stupid. I didn't have help. I had a tab of emails and a receipt. I had a wife who, in some painful and private way, stabilized the edges of my daytime. Ended up there. Thousand in the PAUSES desk to make someone woed mobs like a pawn. And so I began, poorly and like someone fumbling to hold a lit match, to find the hands at the edge of the alley. Amaya's story unfurled, reluctantly. The bruise around her wrist came from the first man who had promised safety and then betrayed it. She had been doing something investigative. She said something that had made certain men uncomfortable. She'd followed a thread, she said, because when you love something, you fight for it with whatever weapons you have. Sometimes those weapons are legal, sometimes they are not. What thread? I asked Maya, tell me. She wouldn't give me names, only hints. A corporation that built condos on floodplain canals. A developer who donated to politicians. Money laundering that smelled like cement and white marble. The things sounded like headlines, the kind of monstrous geography you can see from a condo window and pretend doesn't touch your life. She admitted, been talking to a journalist. She was digging. Maya said, I thought I could help. I never thought they'd come after you. Maya's breath hitched. They don't threaten people like us, at least not usually. But sometimes greed learns new lessons. It began to fit a shape. The men in the alley, professional, neat, the kind who could afford to be patient, were bad at hiding their roles. Phone numbers, addresses, email headers. They were all breadcrumbs. My anger, sharpened by fear, became something I could use. I started calling. I lied okay. I lied a lot, using the kind of voice I had when bargaining for freelance rates, asking about missing shipments and backdoor contracts. People with shady ties leave a lot of trace when they think nobody is looking. By dusk, I had 3 names and a lead. The first man, whose face I still saw in the van's shadow, was a small time coordinator for a private security firm. His name was Carver. He handled logistics, moving people from A to B and making sure their movements didn't raise the right sort of questions. Carver had connections to a developer, Loring and Kessler, a company with donations on the mayor's desk and a taste for waterfront property. The chain smelled of cement and laundered cash. It was a path into things, boardrooms, charity galas, smiling men whose suits hid pockets of venom. I would have to go into that world to find out why my wife had sat in a van at 21 Cortlandt Alley and come back with a bruise on her wrist and secrets in her mouth. I didn't tell the police about the emails. I didn't tell them until I had a place where they couldn't just shrug and file it under unrelated. I became a man with a mission and a lousy sense of how dangerous missions could be. At a Loring and Kessler corporate event, the air smelled like appetizers and something more toxic, arrogance. I sat in the back, a borrowed suit which made me feel like a man trying on someone else's teeth. The crowd mingled, polite and insulated. There was a man on the stage making a speech about revitalization and community investment, the clichés of men who take everything and call it regeneration. His name was Jonathan Kessler, and he had the sort of smile that gets photographed for the business pages. I overheard the kinds of sentences you don't get to hear without the privilege of being ignored. Keep the press fed, keep the zoning boards bribed, and keep the litigation quiet. In a corridor, I found Carver talking to a suited woman who looked like she could file 1,000,000 legal letters before breakfast. Carver's face was different out of the van, less petulant, more slick. He had a business card I could pocket. He had a phone that would be the perfect bridge to the men who'd put my wife in a van. I followed Carver. I didn't have courage so much as a hunger that felt like a tool. He met someone in a dark office. I crept close enough to hear snippets, words like consultant and retainer, and a phrase that made me stop breathing. Settle the casualty quietly. The voice belonged to a man with a moneyed accent, and he said, "We'll make it disappear. We don't like messy." The kind of sentence that means someone died inside of a spreadsheet. I recorded the conversation on my phone, the way any decent fool would, and the voice gave me what felt like a rope to pull the rest of the knot. I took the file to Lucy and to a friend of Maya's I'd only met before in the dark of her apartment, Grace, the journalist Maya had been working with. Grace was a bright woman with less patience than I had for hedging. When I handed her the file, she paled like someone who had been given a match and a pyre. "This is enough," Grace said, "but it's interesting enough that if we run it, people will die." I thought about that, about what it means to press a button that sets other lives in motion. The greedy don't always die. The innocent get the bruises on their wrists. "What do you want to do?" I asked. She looked at me for a long time, the sort of look that reassigns roles in a heartbeat. "We build a record. We give it to the right people, not the cops who shrug, not the reporters who chase headlines. We go to a prosecutor that hasn't been bought. We found one." She took our evidence in a small, carpeted office that smelled like old coffee. The prosecutor, Deputy District Attorney Margot Shaw, was all business. She read and then she read again. "This could blow up," she said. "If we do it right, we can drag them into daylight." It was the first time anyone in authority had said the words "do it right," and made me feel like someone who wasn't entirely deluded. We drafted subpoenas, served papers, and watched Loring and Kessler squirm like a thing that tastes fitful sunlight for the first time. And though the legal machinery began to turn slowly, my impatience became a liability. Men like Carver didn't just contract to move people for money. They also knew how to make threats beautiful. The threats arrived as messages, the van outside my block at night, tires that had a way of going flat in pairs, a note left on our door, "Stick to your lane, Aaron." The prosecutor wanted calm, evidence, witnesses. I wanted every name in that company to taste the sort of fear that makes a man sweat. I wanted revenge for not seeing the bruise until it was on my wife's wrist. I wanted restitution for the time I had spent thinking the city was not capable of being that cheap. My rage almost always wants quick wins. It wanted to slash and brand and burn. The legal world needs time and patience. Grace and Margot were trying to make a bridge between both. I felt like part construction worker and part arsonist. The week before the grand jury convened, everything staggered into chaos. Carver disappeared. Van ownership traced to a shell company with ties to Loring and Kessler's private accounts. A courier dropped a package at our doorstep. A photograph of Meyer in the van taken the day she first disappeared, her face terrified and blurred. A line of hands, scrawled ink at the bottom, said, "She's not a martyr. She's expendable." My hands shook enough to drop the photograph. The city felt like something that could swallow you and not note it on any ledger. I wanted to punch something that mattered. So I punched the wall. Flesh and concrete both hurt, but only one bled. The cut on my knuckle throbbed as if to ask, "Will you keep going?" The grand jury convened. Depositions were taken. Executives squealed the way animals do when pressure squeezes them, deflecting, lying, claiming plausible ignorance. The more the prosecutor seized, the more people around us began to fall away. Matthew Kessler, Jonathan's son, texted me something I couldn't parse. Be careful. A man who had once pretended to be a friend of the city, now a worm in its ear, sent me a message with the velvet tone of betrayal. Then, one morning, someone set fire to our car. They came for me in other, more personal ways. I had a meeting scheduled with an informant one night in a diner when the world went wrong. 2 men followed me afterward, decided to run me off the road. A cab driver, probably feeling the city's rough magnetism, rammed into the side of my bicycle and left me in a ditch with a mangled handlebar and a forever tinnitus. The van made a habit of appearing in the reflection of my home windows. Maya stared at me, silent and shivering, when I limped back into our apartment. There was a new bruise on her neck. She had her hands wrapped around a cup of tea like it was something that could warm her bones. "They can't scare us," she said. "That's what they want. I should have believed that. I should have trusted the plan." But then worries got personal and strategy got noisy. The prosecutor told us to be patient, to gather, to shield witnesses. Grace started sleeping at our place to keep watch, which made me alternately grateful and embarrassed. The city felt like a game board with a lot of knives built into it. One night in the apartment, after the van's tires had been slashed and our door steamed with some cheap chemical they used to scare people, Maya said something that scared me more than the men in the van. "Aaron," she said quietly, "if anything happens to me, if I'm not me anymore, promise me you won't do something stupid." I looked at her as if answering anyone else's question would be treason. "I promise." Her eyes were wet. "Then you have to keep it legal." I hated being told to be legal. The world had been ugly, and legal never seemed to care. But her plea was the sort of thing that made me stop and think about consequences, not in anger, but with softness. I promised, and the promise felt like a pact with the person I loved more than my own breath. The trial came. The prosecutor laid out a map of deceit shell companies, bribed zoning officials, cozy donations, and then the ugly thing that had been a constant shadow: van hires to move troublesome witnesses out of sight. The public was shocked in the polite way people get shocked by hearings. There was outrage, and then a weekend with a sporting event. And the outrage softened into op-eds. During the trial, my world split into a before and after. In the courthouse, faces I had once seen at charity galas glared at me like I had stolen candy from babies. Jonathan Kessler's jaw was a line under the news. He insisted he had no knowledge. The men in suits who'd hired Carver offered up explanations with the smoothness of people who had spent their lives arranging the edges of disasters. One day, late in the afternoon, the paper carrier outside our building handed me an envelope thick with photocopies. Inside were records bank day, approving transfers of large sums to a shell entity. The records were stamped with bank names I'd never thought to suspect. In the margins of the printouts was a handwritten note: "We can protect you. We can help you move forward." No signature. Fear felt like an adhesive by now. The threats were not just theatrical. People disappeared, Carver for one. A courier in the case must have been bought, and an informant in witness protection turned up dead in a Motel 6 with what looked like a staged suicide. The city was patient, and the wrong things gave cover like a fog. But then an unexpected voice rose. A former employee of Loring and Kessler's who had had enough. He testified about a payment schedule and the cozy practice of sending people away quietly. He'd worked on the logistics and had a conscience that had finally turned inside out. He named names. He told the grand jury about an instruction from above: remove obstacles quietly. I watched his testimony. In his eyes, there was the exhaustion of someone who had helped build the machine and then watched it devour what it had promised to protect. The grand jury returned indictments. Loring and Kessler's board shuffled like a deck of cards, the faces of the corporate men now hollow. And then there was the confession. It came not from the mouth of any man in a suit, but from a cell phone wiretap that the prosecutor had managed to secure. A seemingly private conversation on a cold night that had been recorded with legality and a finesse that made me grateful and small. It was Jonathan Kessler on the line, voice low, saying things he had never meant to have recorded. "We had a problem," he said. "The girl was in our way. We couldn't have the press, so we made her an expense." Hearing those words punctured something inside me that had been held together by blind love and stubbornness. The prosecutor looked at me over the witness box like someone offering me a hand to climb out of a ditch. "We can put him away," she said, "but it will hurt. People will turn. People will spin." I wanted his head on a platter. I wanted him to understand the bruise on my wife's wrist the way only prison grease can teach. Justice moved then with a coordinated brutality. Charges were filed, arrests were made. The city spoke of restitution in measured, sterile tones. We did win. Jonathan Kessler and key players were indicted. Carver was found in a truck with his throat slit in an alley 3 days later, and the blood made a map that didn't belong on any accountant's ledger. Loring and Kessler declared bankruptcy. The buildings never rise now where their permits once promised them. But victory was not clean. Evidence was shaky in places, and witnesses withdrew under pressure. A man on the stand recanted and then disappeared. The trial dragged like magma, and Kessler, in his arrogance, made threats that had the unvarnished echo of possibility. At the end of the trial, the jury deliberated for a long time. I waited in a hallway that felt like a crucible. When the verdict came guilty on several counts, Maya fell into my arms like someone drowning who had been given a rope. I wanted to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt hollow and whole at once, as if exercising something had emptied me of the thing that had been mine to hold. Justice, where it lands, can be precise like a scalpel. It cuts, but it leaves scars. And months later, the city's noises were the same. Delivery trucks, subway screeches, the low hum of people who dream in public. Maya quit investigative work and took a job counseling families whose small tragedies cost them sleep. Grace won an award. The prosecutor moved up the ladder. I went to therapy and learned to say the words, "I am scared," without collapsing into a siren. There was one price I had not foreseen. In the week after the verdict, a man with the soft confidence of someone used to ordering violence came to our apartment with papers signed release forms from people we hadn't known we had sold. He said with the polite cruelty of a man who thinks he does favors, "You should be happy, it's settled." Settled meant a hush money arrangement had been put in place to prevent other victims from suing. It meant that some of the worst faces were off the hook in exchange for corporate apologies and charitable contributions that would be named after children none of us knew. Loring and Kessler had not only paid to remove obstacles, they'd paid to install forgiveness. It tasted like money soaked in cheap perfume. It made me want to vomit. I wanted to stand on the steps of the courthouse and scream until the city dialed down its attention span. I wanted a pure ending, but the world rarely gives pure things. Meyer and I sat on our couch and made a different promise than the one we'd made in the aisle of a supermarket years before. We would try to live a life not dominated by what had happened, but shaped by what we learned. She would try to heal. I would try to forgive myself for not seeing the bruise earlier and for not doing more. We would fight in public where it mattered, and in private with gentleness. One night, late, as snow made the city hushed like a film set, Maya turned to me and said, "Do you regret checking my location?" I looked at her the way I had in the alley months before. when the city felt like a thing that might swallow us whole. No, I said, if I hadn't, I wouldn't have found you in that van. I wouldn't have followed the thread. I wouldn't have known what they were willing to do. She put her hand in mine and squeezed. It hurt, she said, but it woke you up and us. It was not a tidy resolution. There were broken people, still living breakers of their own. My hands still remembered the sting of being shoved in an alley. But the city had shifted a little. Laws tightened. Donors began to ask questions instead of just writing checks. There was a watchdog group now one Grace had helped found that monitored corporate donations to political campaigns. It was small and fragile and would probably be co-opted and then reinvented again. A journalist's life is mostly a series of chafing victories and moral triumphs that take a while to stain the system. On a late morning, I walked the route Maya took to work. The alley smelled of something burnt and familiar. There was a new mural painted on a plywood wall, wheat, colors and faces, a tribute to the nameless things the city loses. At the bottom, someone had written in careful, looping script, "We remember." I thought of the blue dot and how the world of phones and maps could rinse off the city's cruelty. I thought about what it asked of us when it pinged a location, whether we'd be brave enough to follow the breadcrumb to wherever it led. I thought about how cheap $15,000 sounded when we put it next to what people will risk to keep their facades. The heart-stopping blue dot had turned me into a man who could not unsee the city's machinery. Revenge had been a hunger, but justice was a grueling thing that you couldn't swallow whole. It had to be munched into small, noble bites. At home, Maya put a hand on my shoulder and laughed when I told her how many times I checked her location now still. Habit, love. She kissed my forehead. Next time, she said, text me instead. I smiled like a man who had been given a second chance at the mundane, the nearly holy task of living ordinary with the person you love. The city's noises went on. There were tentative reforms, watching committees, and people pretending to know better. There were also long nights when my mind rewound the van and the bruise and the man's voice, but the city had a small crack in its armor now. It could be pressured, it could be made to remember. We would make it our job to keep that memory alive. I still check her location sometimes because old habits anchor new lives. The blue dot appears, steady as a heart. Once, years later, when we walked past 21 Cortlandt Alley and the mural glowed in the afternoon, a young woman looked at us, then at the painted faces and asked, "Did it really change anything?" Maya squeezed my hand and said, "It did enough. It made men answer, and that's where you start." We walked on. New York remembered, sometimes cruelly, sometimes kindly, but at least this time it had to answer for its ghosts.